The library door at Ashcombe Hall stood half open on the night of October the 14th, and through that gap came Crispin's voice. Easy, unhurried, pitched to a friend rather than to a room. And what Imogen heard in the corridor stopped her as cleanly as a hand pressed flat against her sternum. 6 weeks married. She had come down for a book because she could not sleep, and she had not yet learned which floorboards in this house announced a person's approach. Her hand found the wall beside the door frame. The embossed wallpaper was cold under her fingers. She registered this with perfect attention, the way she registered everything when the rest of her mind had gone somewhere she could not follow it. Inside, Crispin's friend from London said something she could not quite hear, something amused and inquiring, and Crispin answered him. He said he had married her fortune, not her, and that a man should be honest about such things. He said it with the ease of a man repeating something he had thought through carefully and arrived at in good conscience. Imogen did not move for a count of 12. She counted them. Then she took her hand from the wall, turned, and walked back upstairs without making a sound. She did not cry. She sat at her writing desk in the room that had been prepared for the Marchioness's new wife. And she looked at the small framed portrait of her father that she had brought from Devon. And she thought about what she needed to do and in what order she needed to do it. Her father had been a meticulous man. He had taught her from the time she was 12 to approach a problem with a ledger rather than a feeling, to itemize what was true, what was lost, what remained, and what could be built from what remained. She drew a sheet of paper toward her and began to write. By dawn, she had dispatched an express to her father's old solicitor in Gray's Inn. The letter was 2 paragraphs, specific and complete. She sealed it herself and gave it to the night groom with instructions that required no explanation. She spent the morning in ordinary routine. She appeared at breakfast. She spoke when spoken to, about the weather and the condition of the lane between the East Field and the home farm. Crispin looked at her twice across the table with an expression she could not read and had decided, she now understood, that she had never been able to read. That had been the whole of the error. She had believed she was learning to read him. She had been learning nothing. That afternoon, while Crispin rode out to inspect a drainage problem on the north boundary, Imogen called for her maid and began, quietly and without explanation, the business of packing. The solicitor's reply arrived by return of express the following morning. It confirmed what her father's careful drafting had always ensured. Every shilling of the Linden fortune had been placed in trust before the marriage, structured in terms that gave her husband no legal access to any part of it. Not the income, not the principal, not the Devon properties. Crispin had married her fortune and had never had it. She had not known, until this moment, how much crueler that made the line in the library. She packed the last of her trunks herself. She ordered the hired carriage for 4 o'clock, and before she went downstairs, she sat at the writing desk one final time, removed the wedding ring from her finger, placed it inside a sealed envelope, and wrote 4 words on the front in her clearest hand. You were right. I have taken what was mine. She left it on Crispin's pillow, where he would find it that evening, and she went downstairs, and she got into the carriage, and she did not look back at the house. She was 33 years old, and she had been a fool for 6 weeks, and she was finished with it. The Great North Road in October rain is a particular kind of miserable. The light flat and gray, the hedgerows stripped, the posting stations smelling of wet wool and horse and smoke. Imogen sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape move past the window and thought about nothing she could not afford to think about. This was a skill she had developed in the 7 years since her father died, the 7 years of suitors whose eyes shifted when settlements were mentioned, the 7 years of learning to assess a room and a man and a motive within the first quarter hour of an introduction. At a point between the second and third posting stations, Somewhere in the flat Midlands, where the road straightens and the sky comes down very low, something gave way in her. She did not know it was coming. One moment she was watching the rain on the glass, and the next she was not watching anything at all, because something was happening in her chest and her throat that had nothing to do with calculation. She pressed her fist against her mouth. She noted distantly that her hands were shaking. She looked at her pocket watch. Not because it mattered, but because looking at the watch gave her hands something to do and her eyes something to fix on. She noted the time. 4 minutes later, she opened the small leather-covered book she kept in her coat pocket and wrote, in her usual precise hand, "Between second and third posting stations. 4 minutes, not to be repeated." She closed the book. She straightened her coat. She looked back out the window at the rain. She did not break again. Uncle Bertram's Marylebone townhouse was lit at the ground floor when the carriage arrived, which meant he was still in his study, which meant she would not have to wake a sleeping household and explain herself to a confused butler in the dark. She knocked. Bertram himself appeared at the study door when the butler admitted her, took one look at her face and her trunks being unloaded from the carriage behind her, and said, "Come in and sit down. I'll get the brandy." "I don't want brandy," Imogen said. "I want your spare room for a fortnight, access to your desk, and your solicitor's name in the morning." Bertram, who was 61 and had known his niece since she was born, poured the brandy anyway and set it on the table beside her without comment. "Tell me what happened," he said. "I will tell you what is relevant," Imogen said. "I have left Lord Ashcombe. I intend to file for separate maintenance. My settled fortune is legally mine, regardless of the marriage, and I want to confirm that with a solicitor by the end of the week. That is what I need from you." Bertram looked at her for a long moment. "Imogen," he said. She met his gaze steadily. "Uncle." He sat down. He did not press her further that night. Within 10 days she had done what she said she would do. The solicitor confirmed her father's trust arrangements in full. The petition for separate maintenance was filed. Her settled fortune, every estate, every income, every shilling her father had spent his life building for her, was confirmed as legally hers, untouchable. On the 11th day, she sat at Bertram's desk and wrote a letter to the small radical press in Paternoster Row that she had anonymously funded through her father's solicitor for 5 years. The press that produced pamphlets on women's property rights and the reform of the marriage laws. The press whose name had never been attached to hers in any public document. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It named her as patron and proprietor in full, and it asked the editor to print the announcement in the next issue. She signed it, "Lady Imogen Carteret, sole heir of the late Earl of Linden," and sent it by hand. 3 weeks after the night in the library, Crispin Ashcombe arrived at Uncle Bertram's townhouse in Marylebone. He came on foot without a servant, and he knocked at the front door himself. Bertram, who knew only that his niece had left a 6-week marriage and had been remarkably unwilling to explain why, was curious enough about the husband to admit him to the drawing room. Imogen was informed. She came downstairs. Crispin was standing at the window when she entered. He turned. He looked, she noticed, as though he had not slept in 3 weeks. Which was, she reflected, approximately accurate. He was still dressed with his usual precision, but there was something in the set of his jaw and the careful stillness of his hands that told her he was holding himself together by an act of considerable will. "Imogen," he said. She settled into her chair. "Lord Ashcombe," she said. He stood for a moment, apparently deciding something, and then he sat as well, in the chair across from hers, and he began to speak. He had prepared what he was going to say. She could hear the preparation in it, the formal cadence, the apology shaped and rehearsed. He said that he owed her an explanation. He said that what she had heard, and he did not ask whether she had heard it, he simply acknowledged that she had, was not the full account of his feelings, that he had spoken carelessly, that he... "Stop," Imogen said. Crispin stopped. She looked at him for a moment. His hands, she noticed, had tightened on the arms of the chair. She said, "I am going to tell you what I want from you tonight. It is not an apology, and it is not an explanation. I have had 3 weeks to think about what an explanation from you is worth, and I have concluded that I do not yet have enough information to evaluate it." "Then tell me what you need," Crispin said. "I need you to leave," Imogen said, "and I need you to write to me." He was quiet. "1 letter," she said, "per month, for 1 year. Not about us, not about this. About what you have done with your time, about what you have read, about what you have understood, about the estate and the tenants and whatever it is you do with your days when there is no one watching you perform being a marquis. 1 letter on the 1st of each month for 12 months. Crispin said, "And if I do?" "At the end of the year," Imogen said, "I will decide whether to read them. If I decide to read them, I will. If I decide not to, I will burn them. Either way, that is when I will have enough information to consider anything else." She paused. "Those are the terms. You may take them or leave them." He opened his mouth to speak. She raised her hand. "You taught me what your words are worth," she said. "I will see whether your time is worth more. That is all I have to say to you tonight. My uncle will show you out." She rose. Crispin rose as well, and she saw him make the beginning of a gesture toward her, his hand lifting slightly, then stopping. And she saw him decide against it, and she was grateful for that one small evidence of judgment. He left without further argument. She heard the front door close, and she stood at the drawing-room window and watched him walk back down the street in the gray October light. And she felt nothing she could name, and several things she could not. She went upstairs and made a note in her small book. Terms set. He accepted without protest. Then she went to work. The letters arrived on the 1st of each month, as he had agreed. Imogen did not read them. She stacked them in the locked drawer of Bertram's desk in the order they arrived, and she turned her attention to other things. And she was very busy with other things, which helped. The press in Paternoster Row was producing, under her named patronage, pamphlets that were making certain drawing rooms extremely uncomfortable. The argument was straightforward. A married woman in England had no legal standing to own property, enter contracts, or act in any financial capacity independently of her husband. The pamphlets documented this, case by case, in plain language. They named names when names could be named. They cited statutes. They were read by exactly the kind of people who found them most inconvenient. Which was the point. Imogen began meeting with solicitors about something larger. There was a petition she had heard discussed, theoretical, dismissed as impossible, that would establish a legal precedent for a married woman's financial personality separate from her husband's. No woman had yet attempted it. The obstacles were considerable. The obstacles were also, she thought, surmountable. Given sufficient money, sufficient allies, and sufficient willingness to be publicly inconvenient. She had all three. Crispin, in Bedfordshire, was doing things that no one told Imogen about directly, but that she heard about obliquely, through the press's network of correspondents and legal observers. He had sold 2 unentailed properties on the Ashcombe estate, quietly, without announcement, and the proceeds had not gone back into the estate's accounts. He had begun attending public sessions at Doctors' Commons, sitting in the gallery, reading the proceedings. He had commissioned a building in the village nearest the Ashcombe home farm, the purpose of which was not yet clear, but which was going up steadily through the autumn. His mother, the Dowager Marchioness, had written to him 3 times. He had not replied. All of this was recorded, Imogen would later discover, in the monthly letters locked in Bertram's drawer. He wrote about what he had done and why he had done it, and what he had understood in the doing of it. He did not address her directly in any of them. He wrote as though he were keeping an account for himself, which was, she would decide when she finally read them, the most honest thing about them. The drawer stayed locked through October, November, December, January, February, and March. 6 letters. The 7th arrived on the 1st of April, the 8th on the 1st of May. Imogen did not touch the drawer. The Dowager Marchioness's letter arrived on a Tuesday in May, delivered by private messenger to Bertram's townhouse, addressed to Imogen in a hand she did not at first recognize. 3 pages, written in the Dowager's own hand. Not dictated, not copied out by a secretary. The seal was the Ashcombe crest. Imogen broke it open at the breakfast table, read the first line, and set her teacup down. She read the letter through to the end. Then she read it again, from the beginning, more slowly. Then she sat with it in both hands for a long time without moving. The Dowager wrote without preamble and without self-excuse. She wrote that she had told Crispin, 3 days before the night of October the 14th, to wound his wife deliberately. She had given him the exact words to use. She had told him that heiresses despised being loved by men who had needed their money, that it was an indignity to a woman of Imogen's position to be loved in that way, and that the kindest thing he could do was to establish, clearly and early, that the marriage was a transaction, so that Imogen would never have to wonder whether his affection was real or performed for her fortune's benefit. She had believed this advice to be sound. She had believed it because her own husband had loved her, and she had spent 40 years unable to trust it. And she had watched that distrust hollow out her marriage from the inside. And she had decided that her son would not suffer the same fate if she could prevent it. She had been wrong. She had given her son a weapon and told him it was a kindness, and he had believed her because he was 38 years old, and still, in some part of himself, his mother's son. She was not writing to ask Imogen to return. She was writing because she had spent 8 months watching what her advice had done, and she could not continue to know it privately. She asked only that Imogen know the truth before making any permanent decision. What Imogen did with the truth was her own affair. The letter was signed, Eleanor Ashcombe, Dowager Marchioness of Ashcombe. I am sorry. Imogen sat with it for an hour. The house was quiet. Bertram was out. The fire in the breakfast room had burned down to coals, and the light through the tall windows moved slowly across the floor as the morning progressed. And Imogen did not get up to add coal to the fire or to call for more tea. She sat and thought about a woman who had spent 40 years not believing she was loved, and what that cost, and what it had cost everyone around her. Then she went to Bertram's desk. She unlocked the drawer. She removed all the 8 of Crispin's letters, laid them in order on the desk, and she began to read. She read them in sequence, without stopping. The first was formal, almost stiff, a report of his days, the estate business, a book he had been reading about agricultural drainage. The second was looser. By the third he had begun to write honestly about what he was thinking, not just what he was doing. He wrote about the session at Doctors' Commons, where he had first understood what her pamphlets were actually arguing. He wrote about the moment he had realized that the trust his late father-in-law had established was structured specifically to protect Imogen from exactly the kind of man Crispin had presented himself as being, and what that understanding had cost him to sit with. The fourth letter described the beginning of the school building in Bedfordshire. The conversations with the tenants, the choice of the site, the endowment structure. He wrote that he had not put her name on it, or his own, because it was not a monument. It was a correction. The fifth letter was the shortest and the most painful. He wrote that he had been at Doctors' Commons again and had seen her in the gallery, and that he had placed himself between her and a man who had jostled her deliberately, and that he had not spoken to her because he had not earned the right to speak to her, and that the distance between what he had said on October the 14th and what he understood now was the longest distance he had ever traveled. By the sixth letter, she was reading differently, not assessing, not calculating, but simply reading, the way she had read her father's letters when he was alive, with her whole attention. The reading lasted until dawn. When she finished the eighth letter, she sat for a long time watching the light come through the window. She did not write to Crispin. She did not write to the Dowager. But the following morning, when the ninth letter arrived on the 1st of June, she opened it at the breakfast table before she opened anything else. Imogen had attended sessions at Doctors' Commons twice before in an observational capacity, taking notes for the petition's groundwork, sitting quietly in the gallery and recording the procedural details she would need. On her third visit, in early July, the gallery was more crowded than usual. A contested will, an audience with opinions, and several men who had decided that a woman sitting alone with a notebook was either an affront or a curiosity. One of them made his position clear with his elbow. It was not an accident. She caught herself against the bench in front of her, and before she had fully righted herself, a hand came to rest briefly at her back, steadying, certain, and then gone. She turned. The man who had stepped between her and the gallery crowd was already withdrawing, his attention directed forward toward the proceedings, his expression entirely neutral. It was Crispin. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge what he had done. He simply remained where he was, positioned between her and the man with the elbow for the remainder of the session. And when the session ended, he did not approach her. He moved through the crowd toward the stairs, and she saw him pause at the door to ensure she had reached the corridor safely, and then he was gone. She did not thank him. She walked to her carriage and sat down and opened the small book in her coat pocket, and she did not write anything in it. She looked out the window at the Thames. That evening she read his 10th letter when it arrived, and his 9th again, and she thought for a long time about a man who had been attending legal sessions for months, with no audience, and no reward, and no certainty that she would ever speak to him again, and who had spent that time learning to understand what she was trying to build. In early September, she hired a carriage and went to Bedfordshire alone. She had heard about the schoolhouse through the press's network. A correspondent in the county had mentioned it in a letter about local educational initiatives. And she had not said to anyone that she intended to go. She gave the driver the address and looked out the window at the late summer fields and thought about nothing in particular. The building was half finished. The walls were up, the roof was on, and a crew of men was working on the windows. One of them, in shirt sleeves with his coat folded over a fence post, was helping a carpenter set a window frame into the south wall. He had his back to her when she arrived. When he turned and saw her standing at the gate, he went entirely still for a moment. Then he put down the frame and walked toward her. "I heard about it through the press's network," Imogen said, before he could speak. "I came to see it." "I know it was not a coincidence," Crispin said. "I won't pretend otherwise." They walked through the unfinished building together. He showed her the schoolroom, large with good windows on two sides. and a fireplace that would heat the room adequately in winter. He explained the endowment structure, the arrangement with the neighboring estates, the terms of the deed. He spoke about it plainly, without performance, the way a man describes work he has done, because it needed doing. At the gate on the way out, they reached for the latch at the same time. Their hands met on the iron. Neither moved. Imogen looked at their hands on the gate. She said, "Why is there no name on the endowment? Not mine, not yours, nothing." "Because it is not a gift to you," Crispin said. "And it is not a monument to me. It is what I should have been all along." She lifted her hand from the latch and opened the gate herself, and they walked out into the lane. And she said she would write to him about what she had seen. He said he would look forward to that. They stood in the lane for a moment in the September light, and then she walked back to her carriage, and he walked back to the building, and that was all. She wrote to him that evening. It was the first time she had written to him directly since the envelope on his pillow. October came, and with it the social consequences she had been expecting. Lady Pembrey, an old ally of the Dowagers, a woman of considerable drawing-room authority, decided that a separated wife running a radical press was an embarrassment to the class, and said so, in the specific and pointed way that such women have. At 3 dinner tables and a card party, 2 of Imogen's supporting allies began finding reasons to be unavailable. A peer who had agreed to witness the petition withdrew under pressure, citing concerns about the precedent's implications for property settlements, which was, Imogen noted in her small book, a precise description of why the petition needed to exist. She doubled the press's output. The essay she published in November ran to 4 pages and argued, in plain and documented terms, that the legal subordination of married women to their husbands in matters of property and contract was not a natural arrangement, but a constructed one, maintained by men who benefited from it and resisted by women who had been told they had no standing to resist. She signed it with her full name and her title. Within 3 weeks, it had been reprinted in 2 London periodicals and 1 in Edinburgh, and she had received letters from 17 women she had never met and 4 solicitors who wanted to discuss the petition. Lady Pembrey's campaign continued. Imogen's campaign continued faster. In November, a fever came on her suddenly. Not a dramatic illness, just the ordinary kind that arrives in autumn in London when one has been working too hard and sleeping too little, and then refuses to leave. By the 2nd day, it was severe enough that Bertram sent for the physician. By the 3rd day, she was confined entirely to her room, which she found deeply inconvenient, and she told the nurse so at some length. She did not know that Bertram had written to Crispin. She found out on the 3rd night, when she woke from a troubled sleep and heard the nurse moving in the room, and asked, without entirely meaning to, who was in the corridor. The nurse looked up from her work. "Lord Ashcombe, my lady. He's been there since yesterday morning." Imogen lay still for a moment. "Has he been inside?" she asked. "No, my lady. He asked after you at the door, and the physician spoke with him, but he's not come in." She looked at the ceiling. "Ask him to come in," she said. He came in quietly and sat in the chair beside the bed, and he did not speak. And she did not speak, and the fire was low, and the room was very quiet. She was too tired and too warm and too stripped of her usual precision to perform anything, and she found that she did not want to. She moved her hand out from under the coverlet and laid it palm up on the sheet between them. He looked at it for a moment, and then he covered it with his hand large and steady and warm, and they stayed that way until the gray light of morning came through the curtains. When she woke fully, she was alone. The fever had broken, On the bedside table, his handkerchief was folded around something small and flat and dry. She opened it, a single pressed flower from the Bedfordshire school garden. She recognized the variety. She had noticed them growing along the south wall. She held it for a long time. Then she put it in her small book, between the pages, where it stayed. The petition was drafted in December, witnessed in January, and filed at Doctors' Commons in the first week of February. By Imogen's deliberate design, the legal language of the filing excluded her husband from any standing to oppose or intervene. The petition concerned her fortune, her legal personality, and the precedent she was establishing. And she had structured it so that his consent was neither required nor relevant. Her solicitor had raised this point with some delicacy. Imogen had told him that this was precisely the point. The hearing date was set for the 17th of March. Crispin received formal notice, as he was required to by procedure. He sent no solicitor. He filed no objection. He wrote his 14th letter on the 1st of March, and it was the shortest of all of them. 4 sentences. He wrote that he had received the notice. He wrote that he would be in the public gallery if she permitted it. He wrote that he would not approach her unless she wished it. He wrote, "I will not stand in the way of what you are building. I never should have." She read it at the breakfast table on the 2nd of March and looked at it for a long time. She wrote back a single line, "You may attend." The 17th of March arrived cold and bright, the kind of spring morning that cannot decide whether it is still winter. The octagonal hall at Doctors' Commons was institutional and high-ceilinged and smelled of stone and old paper. And Imogen walked into it with her uncle at her right and her solicitor at her left and 2 women from the press behind her. And she sat at the petitioner's table and arranged her papers and looked at the bench. And she did not look at the public gallery. The hearing took 40 minutes. The legal arguments had been prepared for 2 years, documented through the press's pamphlets, supported by 3 solicitors, and grounded in a reading of the existing statutes that her team had spent 6 months constructing. The bench asked 11 questions. Imogen answered 8 of them directly. Her solicitor handled the remaining 3. At the end of 40 minutes, the petition was granted. The sound in the hall was not applause. This was Doctors' Commons, not a theater. But something shifted in the air. A collective exhale, a movement among the women from the press behind her. Imogen gathered her papers, spoke briefly to her solicitor, accepted Bertram's hand on her arm, and walked out into the courtyard. Crispin was there. He was standing near the gate at the far end of the courtyard, not blocking the path, not positioned to intercept. Simply present, in the open, where she could see him and choose. When she came through the door with her uncle and her solicitor and the 2 women from the press, he said her name once. Just her name. She turned. The courtyard was not empty. There were other parties emerging from the building. Solicitors, observers, 2 journalists who covered Doctors' Commons proceedings. Several of them stopped when Crispin spoke, because a man calling his separated wife's name in a public courtyard was unusual enough to notice. He walked toward her slowly and stopped at a reasonable distance, and he looked at her. And then he looked at the people around them, and he spoke anyway. "I was wrong," he said, "on the night of October the 14th, 14 months ago. My mother told me to wound you deliberately, and I did, because I believed she was protecting you from something worse. I was wrong to listen to her. I was wrong to believe that cruelty could be a kindness. I have spent the months since then trying to understand what I destroyed. And I am not going to ask you to come back." He paused. He was not a man who spoke publicly about private things. She could hear the cost of it in the slight roughness of his voice, the way each sentence came out deliberate, like something carried with care. I am asking you to know. For the rest of your life, whatever you do with it, whatever you decide, I want you to know that I loved you on the morning I married you. And I love you now. And those are the first completely honest words I have said to you since we met. The courtyard was very quiet. Imogen looked at him. She thought about the locked drawer, and the 8 letters read through the night, and the hand on the gate in Bedfordshire, and 3 days in a corridor, and a pressed flower in a handkerchief. She thought about the Dowager's 3 pages, and what 40 years of not believing in love looked like from the inside. She thought about the petition she had just won, and the document in her solicitor's bag that established in legal precedent that she was a person in her own right with no requirement to justify herself to anyone. She said, in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "I have known for 6 months. Your mother wrote to me in May. I read your letters the same night." She watched something move through him at that. Not relief, not quite, but something that had been held too long finally setting down its weight. "I have been watching from a distance since then. The school, the sold properties, the sessions at Doctors' Commons. I know what you have done, and I know why you did it." She paused. "I will not return as your wife. The marriage we had is not a thing I can go back to." He held her gaze. He did not flinch. But," she said, "if you are willing, I will allow you to court me again. From the beginning. With no fortune at stake, because the petition has just established that mine is legally untouchable regardless of what either of us does. No family arrangement, no settlements, no expectation carried over from what we were. You asking a woman who owes you nothing, with nothing to offer her that she cannot provide for herself." She looked at him steadily. "That is what I am offering. You may take it or leave it." Crispin said quietly, "I will take it." 3 days later, Imogen sent a formal note to Bertram's townhouse, where Crispin was staying while he was in London, inviting him to call at 4 o'clock. He arrived at 4 o'clock precisely. They sat in the small back parlor with the fire going, and they talked for 2 hours about entirely inconsequential things. A pamphlet she was editing, a problem with the drainage at the Bedfordshire school, a book he had been reading about Roman roads. Neither of them said anything of particular weight. It was, she thought, the most comfortable 2 hours she had spent in a very long time. When he rose to leave, she rose as well and walked him to the door. At the door, she stopped him by the simple act of standing close enough that he would have to move past her to leave. And she looked at him. And then she kissed him, once, slowly, at her threshold, in her uncle's house, at her own invitation. His hand came up to her face, and she let it stay there. And then she stepped back and looked at him. 4 o'clock on Thursday, she said. He held her gaze a moment. 4 o'clock on Thursday, he agreed, and went down the steps into the March evening, and she closed the door. He called on Thursdays and wrote on Tuesdays. He brought no gifts and made no declarations. He asked her questions about the petition, about the press, about what she was planning next. And he listened to the answers the way a man listens when he is genuinely uncertain what the answer will be. He told her about the school, about the tenants, about the particular difficulty of finding qualified teachers willing to work in Bedfordshire. He told her once about the night he had found the envelope on his pillow and what the following weeks had been like. He said it plainly and without self-pity, and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "I know. I timed it by my pocket watch in the carriage. 4 minutes. He looked at her steadily. "I noted it in my book," she said. "I have a book." I know, he said. You mentioned it in the 7th letter. She had forgotten she had written that. You remember the 7th letter? I remember all of them, he said. I wrote them. I had some time to think about what I was saying. She received the Dowager once, in April, in the offices of the press in Paternoster Row. The Dowager arrived in a hired carriage, not her own, Imogen noted, and sat in the chair across from the desk, in a room that smelled of ink and warm paper, and looked nothing like any room the Dowager had ever occupied. She was 63, and she looked smaller than Imogen had expected. She sat with her hands folded, and she looked at the pamphlets stacked on the shelves, and she did not speak immediately. You may say what you came to say, Imogen said. The Dowager said, I came to ask whether you would receive me as a daughter. Her voice was even. No, Imogen said. I will not. The Dowager nodded slowly. Her eyes were very bright. I understand. I want you to understand something else, Imogen said. The wound is not unmade by knowing why it was made. You gave him a weapon and told him it was kindness, and he used it because he trusted you. And that is a thing that happened and cannot be unhappened. I am not your enemy. I am not going to work against you or cut your acquaintance publicly or prevent Crispin from seeing you. But I will not be your daughter. And I will not pretend that what you did was a mistake made in ignorance. Because you knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing. The Dowager looked at the pamphlets on the shelves. After a moment, she said, My husband loved me for 31 years, and I never let myself believe it. Not once. I thought I was protecting myself. She stopped. I was wrong about that too. She wept quietly into her gloves. Imogen gave her a handkerchief, a plain one from the desk drawer, and waited. And when the Dowager had composed herself, Imogen stood, and the Dowager stood, and they parted with formal politeness and no warmth. And that was all. Walking back from the press to the carriage afterward, Imogen thought about 40 years of not believing in love. And what it cost everyone within reach of the person who carried it. She thought about the small book in her coat pocket, and the 4 minutes timed in a carriage in the Midlands, and the pressed flowers still between its pages. She thought about the difference between protecting yourself and walling yourself in, and how long it had taken her to see that the wall she had built was not a fortress, but a room with no windows. She did not write anything in the book. She looked out the carriage window at the London spring, the trees in the squares coming into leaf, the light different now from the October gray of Ashcombe Hall. And she let herself feel what she felt without ledgering it. And she found that she could do this without the sky falling. In May, Imogen purchased a townhouse in Bloomsbury, in her own name, under the legal precedent her petition had established. The deed named her as sole owner. She registered it, paid for it, and signed the papers herself. And when she came out of the solicitor's office onto the spring street, she stood on the pavement for a moment and felt the very particular satisfaction of a thing done completely, without compromise, with no one else's name attached to it. She invited Crispin to dinner on the 23rd of May. The house was not yet fully furnished. There were rooms still empty, and the dining room had a borrowed table. But the fire in the sitting room was good, and the cook she had hired had strong opinions about the proper construction of a syllabub, and the evening had the quality of something being lived in for the first time. They ate and they talked, and the candles burned down, and the fire settled, and the evening deepened into the particular stillness of a house that has been waiting for its occupants to notice it. When Crispin set down his wine glass and looked at her across the low fire, she looked back at him. And they had been doing this, she thought, for 4 months. looking at each other across rooms, across gates, across courtyard steps, across a bed in the dark. And she was tired of rooms between them. He began to rise, with the punctual courtesy he had maintained for every visit for 4 months. The same movement toward leave-taking that she had come to recognize as his discipline, his respect, his patient acknowledgement that she was the one who would decide. She crossed the room and put her hand on his sleeve before he had fully stood. He stilled. She did not speak. She looked at him, and she read his face. Not the face she had thought she was learning in the spring of the year before. But this face, the one that had been written by 14 months of consequence and work and honest letters and 3 nights in a corridor. And she found that she could read it clearly, without doubt, without the old fear whispering in the back of her mind that she was mistaking transaction for truth. She turned the key in the lock behind him. Morning came through the tall windows in long pale bars, touching the floor, the borrowed table, the books stacked along the wall. 2 cups of tea sat on a single tray on the small table by the fire. From the writing desk near the window came the quiet scratch of a pen. Imogen sat with her coat pulled over her shoulders and a fresh page before her, drafting the opening of a new pamphlet, the first of what she intended to be a series on the practical application of the precedent she had established, written for women who had no solicitor and no uncle with a Marylebone townhouse and no £80,000 in trust. She paused and read over what she had written. Then she dipped the pen and signed it, for the first time, at the top of the page, rather than the bottom. Imogen Carteret Ashcombe. Her name first, his second, both chosen, the hyphen between them, her punctuation, and no one else's. Crispin, reading at the window, looked up. He looked at the page, and at her, and he did not say anything. But she saw the corner of his mouth move. And she turned back to her work, and the morning light moved slowly across the floor of the house that was hers. And the story that had begun in a cold corridor with a hand on an embossed wall ended here. In warmth, in spring, with ink still drying on a name she had given herself.